shelter in the shadows from the creatures of the night. Tentacles that slither just out of sight. Dark curses conjuring an endless dreadful blight. Beware the evil that goes bump in the night, lest you give yourself a fright with Mystic Moon tonight.
Welcome to Mystic Moon Cafe. You've got Jake here. Our co-hosts with the mostest, Merle and Wendy, couldn't be here today, stuck in the horrible snow and storms rolling through. So I've got Troy Taylor here today, and you may know Troy for his paranormal and true crime writings. So, in a quick bio for everyone here, Troy Taylor is the author of more than 120 books about ghosts and the unexplained in America. He's the founder and owner of American Hauntings Tours and Events, and the founder of the Haunted America Conference, which is coming up in June 2023. People, tickets are going on sale soon, if not already. And along with writing about the unusual and hosting tours, Troy is also a public speaker on the subjects of ghosts and hauntings, and he's appeared in scores of newspaper, magazine articles, and about the subject of the paranormal and unknown. And of course, he's been on hundreds of radio and television broadcasts about the supernatural. So, Troy, how you doing?
Hey, thanks. I never know what bio it's going to be. So I was speaking somewhere and somebody got up and said, Troy Taylor is the author of 40 books. And I went, oh, man. So, that was an old one. But yeah, so thank you for that. I appreciate it. So I'm glad to be.
Yeah. And with the holiday season, I'm just going to drop. Troy has a new book out. Actually, I think it came out mid-November of this year. We've got it right here. Very appropriate for the season. It's called One Bleak Midwinter Night, and terror and tragedy of the holiday season, loaded with true crime, ghosts, monsters, disasters, and all this other feel-good stuff for the season.
Yeah, it's all. Hey, well, the idea was bringing back the tradition of ghosts and horror stories for Christmas. I mean, they never lost it in England, but for some reason we just never really got it here. Not at least it's not the same. So I thought, our ancestors did it, so we should too. Why not huddle around the fire? And I mean, it looks like we're going to get a Christmas, at least in the upper Midwest, get a Christmas that's going to be not a whole lot of travel anyway. So why not stay home and tell ghost stories around the fire? So that was kind of the idea behind the book. I've been trying to do that for a long time, but I finally put it into print this year. So, it was a lot of fun. It's a terrible book to write. I mean, it's awful. I mean, it's filled with, people being, murdered and dying in fires and all kinds of things. But it was, I guess that's what made it fun, but it was a fun book to write. So,
well, yeah, I think a lot of people forget, and you mentioned this in the book, it's kind of book-ended. It's about when we think about things on the calendar about mid-December through, I think it's Orthodox Christmas is like January 5th or 6th. Mm-hmm. It is the most gangster time of the year for ghosts and monsters.
Right.
Like, worse than Halloween.
Right. I always tell everybody that, to our ancestors and to the pagans, I mean, the scary time of year started with Halloween. That wasn't meant to be scary. That was the harvest festival. And then, then it gets scary after that, up until really the spring thaw, but definitely through January 6th. I mean, that was the season of witches and monsters and everything else. And even when the church started taking things over, they still kept pushing all that witch stuff, hey, look out for the monsters and the witches, they're just angry because we're celebrating Christmas as this holiday we just made up to stick in here, but that's okay. Where the witches are all out there. And so it's always been that way, but we've just sort of lost it, So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way I like to refer to it is like up to Halloween, Thanksgiving, get you plump. Think about Hansel and Gretel. And then by the time Christmas rolls around, you're too fat and can't get around, and you're slim pick. I mean, it's easy pickings.
You are easy picking. So if there's a dozen different Christmas monsters waiting out there to eat you, and if not that, if you've been lazy and bad throughout the year, then Perchta will come and rip your stomach open and fill your insides with straw and garbage. So it's such a fun, light, a happy time of year. So,
Yeah, I mean, cannibalism is at its peak for sure.
Exactly. Which is, where our Santa Claus story comes from. Yeah. Everybody forgets that St. Nicholas was an actual saint who was bringing people back from the dead because they were being eaten by a French butcher. So it's, these are stories that we tend to forget about over time. So
that's Hans Trop, people. For
yeah, and that guy had a name. So
oh no, sorry, that was Père Foutard.
Sorry. Oh yes.
Hans Trop, it's another cannibal, but
right. My thing is always that St. Nicholas really hangs around with a bad crowd. He really should think about upping his, the people he hangs around with, honestly, from Krampus to, Black Peter to, just a grim bunch of people. So,
yeah, I was going to say, I'm about to get into, we're talking about Xmas background. We're going to talk about Monsters of the Season 2, but I was like, so you got St. Nick's Day, which is about December 6th. Krampus Nacht is the 5th. So, anti-Santa comes, whoops the kids,
Right.
When they do the parade, Saint Nick, sorry, it's not Santa, Saint Nick is going down the street, and which henchmen are he bringing? Well, Krampus shows up.
Yes.
Black Peter shows up.
Yep.
Hans Trop shows up. Père Foutard and his wife, Mother Flogger.
Right.
They're all in the parade. I'm just like, I mean,
yes, I'm very confused, but we got somebody awful for every culture that way. Yeah.
So when you were researching the book, you kick it off with a lot on the origins of Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
What was the most surprising part in your research? Things we as dumb Amerikanskis don't necessarily get about
Well,
Christmas.
I mean, I guess the thing about it, for me, I wouldn't say it's surprising to me just because this is something I've been obsessed with forever. But when I tell friends about it, because we'll sit around and talk about some of these stories, and I'll make some comment about people talking about the reason for the season and stuff, and I'll go, whoa, wait a minute now, so when people talk about Santa Claus, and we talk about the original Santa Claus was really Odin, the Norse god who traveled around on the wild hunt and would stop to graze his animals. And he would leave gifts for the kids that would put out hay for the animals. And so then he started leaving it in their boots that they left outside. So that's where our Santa Claus and the stockings and all that comes from. And then, then the Celts had their traditions, and then the Vikings invaded the Celts. And so they mixed everything all together. And then you had the Greeks and the Romans celebrating all this stuff with Saturnalia. Which is pretty much from December 17th through the 25th, which is, if December 25th rings a bell, it's because the church decided to use that date because it was an important pagan festival. And they took the story of the god Mithra, who was the god of soldiers, who had been born to a virgin, if any of this sounds familiar. And they took the story of the king who died to save his people and came back to life, and the rebirth of the sun. And then they just sort of, decided that they should just use all these things to wipe out the idea, the way that the pagans, worshiped their own gods, and change it to the one God. So that's where Christmas came from. According to the Bible, Christ was born in the spring, but for some reason, December 25th seemed like a much better time, I guess, because it got rid of the winter festivals. And, I don't know. It's that kind of stuff always amazes people when they hear it for the first time. They always laugh, and you'll see things posted online that'll say, the pagans want their holidays back and they're angry, and things like that. But it was, but everything changes. I mean, just the same way that the same way that the church took over all the festivals and turned it into something else. I mean, the pagans had done the same thing. The Norse had done the same thing to the Celts. The Greeks did the same thing to the Romans. I mean, it's natural progression of time. So it's fascinating to see how this stuff got its start, and some of the legends and the way that things like witches managed to carry over from the times of the pagans into the days of the church. They just changed the stories of the witches and made them, more evil. And, suddenly they weren't just riding around taking care of the spirits of dead children anymore. Now they were trying to get at the good Christians and stop them from going to church. So people were encouraged to hide their brooms and things so that the witches couldn't fly around on them, and, all kinds of stuff like that. So, it's always interesting. And working the way through, and I did a huge chapter in the book working our way through how Santa Claus got started, because that's a lot of really grim stuff too. I mean, with St. Nicholas starting out as kind of a non-biblical saint that's, probably more widely known than anybody but the Virgin Mary, and yet he really doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible, because he was a rich guy who became a saint, giving away all his money. And story goes that he was putting gold coins in the daughters of this man who's he was afraid that they wouldn't have enough money for their dowry, so he was giving them gold coins so they didn't have to become prostitutes. And I thought, well, that seems like a extreme leap, but whatever, that's the way that the story went. But he was it became the saint of like bankers and pawnbrokers and butchers and sailors and pirates, prostitutes, and thieves. So, I mean, this is which kind of explains, I guess, why he hangs around with people like Krampus. I mean, you look at it that way. But, and then, as I already mentioned, his big miracle was finding out that these 3 boys had been cut apart and salted and put into barrels to be fed to people as meat during a famine. And when an angel came and told him about it, he ran over to the butcher shop and resurrected these kids. So that's quite a story. I mean,
meat's meat. Man's got to eat.
I guess.
Succulent little kids.
I know, right? So, but then he starts traveling around with Krampus and all these other people. But even before that, we had, all these different Santa Clauses and different people, and Père Noël and Father Christmas and England, and they all end up in the United States, and nobody knows what to make of it, what to call it. Eventually, they badly mangle a German word for him and turn it into Santa Claus. And then, nobody still knows what he looks like, even though there's been some stories and poems and things written about him, until Coca-Cola starts doing ads in 1930. And then suddenly we got Santa Claus, because now every Santa Claus looks just like those Coca-Cola ads. Mm-hmm. They may not have been the first, but they're the ones who made it popular. I don't care what you hear or think. That's the Santa we know, is the Coca-Cola Santa, which is okay. It's cool. He's got a good look. And it's something that we can all relate to. It's hard to relate to things like Krampus and things, because now it is. Now we know it, but it didn't used to be part of our culture. Not really.
Yeah. And now it's time for a Merle scary story. Yeah. I mean, when the States, we were still the colonies and everything, the Puritans were having none of Christmas.
Nope.
Whatsoever.
Oh, no. Yeah, that's what's so funny. Every time I see something about, there's a war on Christmas to stop us from celebrating. Hey, the only people that ever banned Christmas were the religious nutcases known as the Puritans, who thought that it was too pagan and too happy. They don't want happy. The Puritans didn't want anybody to be happy. And so they banned Christmas from like 1675 to 1681. No Christmas, because it's just too jolly. So that's the only people that declared war on Christmas were the religious people, which makes no sense now when people complain about it.
Well, I mean, you got to work. Work. And there was too much drinking.
Too much
too much laziness. But that's interesting. So with your research on the book and all the different traditions that we were talking about, which one do you think had to be, say, the creepiest or kind of out of left field? For me, it's Santa started out as a Greek guy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's weird. That is weird. I don't know. I think that when you get into some of the monsters and things, I mean, that's some scary stuff. But as far as like some of the traditions go, as far as what started where, I don't know. As far as creepy, there are plenty of stories about the witches. And as far as the monsters go, we don't really have any that are based in our country. All of them are brought in from somewhere else. But I like the some of the fun things like the Mary Lloyd, the guys that wander around, because that is kind of an American thing, because in the 1840s and 50s, before we really celebrated Christmas, okay, so thanks to Queen Victoria, we started having Christmas trees and stuff. But prior to that, people didn't celebrate Christmas at home. They went out drinking and partying and went wild in the streets, broke into people's houses, stole their food, drank their booze. They set off guns and rang bells and everything in the street, because they knew that after Christmas, you're screwed. You are stuck in the house with your horrible family for the rest of the winter. So you don't want to spend Christmas at home. So that was always kind of a cool American tradition, that we started it as like a party holiday, like New Year's Eve, right? But then, the Welsh and the Canadians kept that going, because they, have the Mary Lloyd, which is a bunch of guys who put a sheet over their head with a big horse's skull. And it is the most terrifying thing you've ever seen. But they actually go around to people's houses and knock on the door and then sing about how they want to come inside. And then the people that answer the door have to sing back about why they can't come inside. So they have like a rap battle over, who, but the dead horse always wins. And so everybody gets to come in and they drink and they party. And the Canadians have the mummers, which I honestly is a bunch of people who put on costumes with underwear on their head and holes in it, and then run around and do the same kind of thing, go to people's houses and put on skits and stuff, except for a little while in the late 1800s when they had to ban the mummery thing for a while, because people were putting on the masks and then committing crimes like the purge or something. So they had to stop doing that. But that's kind of come back again too. So those are kind of, that seem scary traditions that aren't, because we don't really have the monsters. But my favorite monster is the Yule Cat.
That's out of Iceland, right?
Yeah, or maybe which Iceland's got some really scary stuff going on there. But I also kind of like the Yule goat out of Sweden too.
Oh yeah,
only because how it really started. I mean, now it's actually a goat, and they'll put up the big goat, the big wicker goat in the town square, and you could buy. I got a Yule goat hanging on my Christmas tree, and Krampus heads, if that tells you anything about my Christmas. But it actually started with like hairy old men in goat skins that used to go around and peek in people's windows at Christmas and decide if you'd been good or not. Yeah. So it really started as like a creepy peeping Tom thing, but then now it's kind of softened up to be a goat. But I like the cat a lot. It's a giant cat in Iceland who, if you don't, let's be honest, the employer started it telling their employees that if they didn't work hard enough on the sheep farms and get all the wool harvested before Christmas, they'd be eaten by a giant cat. And people believed it, because hey, why not? And so it's a monstrous cat that kind of stalks the mountains and kills people, which is, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't really say Merry Christmas, but it's kind of an interesting thing. And they have the Yule lads too, who are the awful little, people who play pranks they go around and play pranks on people. And then their mother is, of course, the Gryla, the giantess who eats children, goes to their house, butchers them up, and turns them into stew if they've been bad. So Iceland sounds like a horrible place to spend Christmas, but I'm sure it's really not. But based on their monsters, it does make you think twice, honestly. So
I love how everything, now just this is a true fact. When I was a child, I was blackmailed into good behavior.
Oh, sure.
By many of these tales, as you can tell, I'm 6 feet tall and blonde, but my family's Norwegian. And so I had a lot of these tales, and I actually had an elf that would stalk us, making notes if we were good or bad. And we had to have significantly more good days than bad days.
So this was different than, this was an Elf on a Shelf. This was before that, because that's
yeah. It was Marky the Elf.
Oh, well, so they kind of stole that idea from somebody else. Then it sounds.
Yeah, totally. And then
the Elf on the Shelf is I'd rather have Krampus. There's something creepy about those elves. I just don't like them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've seen all the can't talk memes with like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees slaughtering the elves.
Yeah.
And if you follow, I just posted the Predator special, and it's the Predator comes after. If you remember Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, all the little elves, the dentist elf, and the Predators come for them, but Santa's ready.
That's good. I like that.
So it's only like 2 minutes long or something. I don't know who made it, but check it out. But we also had to keep us safe at night. We had Ugalaga the Troll.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. I didn't know that one either. That's a good one.
I think this was just invented by the Rice Olsons.
Oh, I see. So that's why I had heard it. I see.
I think it was just to blackmail me and my two older brothers.
I see. Yeah. Well, hey, as long as it worked, I mean,
yeah. So, yeah. So overall, the book is not surprising, folks. It's true crime heavy. So Troy, with these horrible events and murders over the Christmas season, holiday season, which one do you think really stands out as the most tragic tale?
Oh boy. Well, there are several. I'll give you a nutshell on a couple of them, and then I'll tell you the one that's really has been my favorite. Favorite is, again, bad way to put it, but you know what I mean.
Everyone's morbid that listens to
okay, well then we're okay. So the story of the Grimes sisters, which happens right after Christmas, has always bothered me. That is an Illinois story, so I kind of grew up with it. It happened in the mid-50s. These two young girls disappeared after going to the movies one night and weren't found for several weeks, and then their bodies were found on the side of the road. A road that did get a reputation for being haunted, not surprisingly. And that's a really sad story because of what happened to the family and the mother and everything related to these two poor young girls. The Lawson family story from North Carolina is awful too. That's a story about Charlie Lawson, who one Christmas just decided to murder his entire family. Everybody but his son, who was 16 and bigger than he was. So he sent him off on an errand on Christmas afternoon to go buy more shotgun shells so that they could hunt rabbits in the afternoon. And then he proceeded to murder all of his kids. His two of his daughters he killed outside, shot his wife out on the front porch, killed his oldest daughter in the kitchen, and then murdered two young boys who were like 2 and 4, and then a 4-month-old baby in her crib. It's an awful story, and then kills himself, not surprisingly. And nobody knows why, not for sure why he did it. He just snapped one Christmas day. So that story is awful, but probably the one that bothers me the most, and not that that's not horrible, because it is, but the story of Marion Parker. It's a Christmas story from 1927. And it's about a little 12-year-old girl in California and LA who was kidnapped and murdered by this 19-year-old lunatic who goes through this very long, complicated story of ransoms and the kidnapping. He kept sending ransom letters to the family and things, but all the while he's already murdered her and cut her up into pieces and has then scattered them around the LA area, except for her torso and her head, which he leaves in his car so that he can go to the ransom pickup and her father will think that she is still alive, which is the most horrible story ever. But the story just kind of has kind of a bittersweet ending to it about the house where the Parkers had lived, and Marion's eventually coming home. So it's one of those. It's kind of like the book itself in that it's all these really dark, horrible stories that also I try to balance it out with a little bit of light and a little bit of hope. But there's only so much that you can give when it's talking about a story like that. So yeah, but that's probably the one that has always bothered me the most as far as the Christmas murders go.
Yeah. And now Wendy tells her terrifying tale. Woohoo! So a couple of my favorite stories, actually. I'm a huge disaster fan, Troy.
Oh yeah. Well, me too, obviously. So.
And so one amazing story, which is a very, if you're from Chicago, so I lived in Chicago for about 18 years, went to college, stayed there. I consider myself a Chicagoan, even though I live in the Pacific Northwest now.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest Christmas time legend for me is the Iroquois Theater.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
And everyone in town knows this because, I mean, there's a theater in its place. It is not the original building.
Right.
And Troy, if you'd like to elaborate on why that is.
Yeah. The Iroquois Theater was opened in 1903, and it was open in November, and it had been built as an absolutely fireproof theater. They had all these designs that were supposed to, the 25 exits would empty the entire building in 5 minutes. And they had, all kinds of this asbestos curtain that would protect the audience from fire, and, all these fire escapes and special doors and things. And they opened, and 6 weeks later, the building caught on fire and was completely gutted and killed 612 people. Now, and to this day is still the greatest theater disaster in American history. And everybody wanted to know how in the world something like this could happen in such a safe theater. And I always say, well, Chicago, the early 1900s, little bit of money goes a long way. People are going to look the other direction. But the theater itself, on the day that the fire happened, was December 30th. It was the holiday break. The theater is filled. It's an afternoon matinee for a popular comedy show called Mr. Bluebeard with a comedian named Eddie Foy. And the theater is filled with children on school break, and a lot of women, teachers, nannies, bringing the kids down, and a lot of families too. But so the place is packed. And not only are all the seats filled, which means that there are, like 1,600 people sitting down. You got another couple of hundred people who are standing room, packed into the aisles, packed into the area at the back of the theater. Plus, you've got 400 cast members behind the stage. So this place is jam-packed. There's over 2,000 people in there, and a fire starts during the second act of the show. Apparently, one of the lights set off some sparks and caught a curtain on fire. Which, not surprisingly, when you have open flames to light your, which is why there have been so many theater fires, which was why this theater was supposed to be absolutely fireproof. But of course, everyone panics and starts running for the doors. Now, everybody who made it out to the lobby got a surprise because they discovered that the doors in the lobby opened inward instead of outward. So when they rammed against those doors, they couldn't get out. So they just kept piling and piling and piling. But that should have been okay, at least for the rest of the people who could have gotten out those emergency fire doors. There were 25 of them. The problem is that the only people who knew how to work the mechanisms on the doors were the ushers. And guess where the ushers had gone when the fire started? Out of the building. So there was nobody left behind. So if they got a few of the doors open, which helped some people escape, there was also the problems in the upper floors where people were trying to get down the stairs to get out of the theater, only to discover that the owners of the theater had instructed the ushers to lock the gates to the stairs to keep people in the cheap seats in the balcony from coming down to take empty seats in the auditorium during the intermission. So they were trapped up there. But that should have been okay because they could have just gone out the fire exit doors. Now, the ones on the lower balcony were able to get out that way. They got to the fire escapes, got down into the alley behind the theater, but everyone who was upstairs in the large balcony discovered that the fire exits, which were one of the lauded, great things about the theater that were going to help people escape, hadn't actually been installed yet. So all there was this platform with no stairs to go down, about 50 feet in the air. And once a few people got out the door, there was no turning back. They couldn't go backwards because there were too many people pushing from behind. A lot of them fell. A lot of them jumped rather than burned to death. There were some workers in the dental school for Northwestern University across the alley who put across a ladder to help some people escape. And they put some boards across, but they only get a handful of people across that. The rest of them ended up falling into the alley. And when the fire was over, the press dubbed that alley Death Alley because they found more than 150 bodies piled up down on the cobblestones in the alley. But again, the fire had started on the stage. So, it was safe for, it should have been absolutely safe because they could put down the big asbestos fire curtain between the audience and the stage. But not only did it get stuck most of the way down, but it turned out that the curtain wasn't asbestos after all. It was just cotton and hemp and linseed oil. And so it's completely flammable. So that just made things worse. So with all of that going on, people were dying. Not only were they burning to death, they were suffocating from the smoke. They were being trampled by other people trying to get out of the theater. And later it would be discovered there were no exit signs because the owners thought they were unattractive, so they didn't install them. The sprinkler system that was supposed to have been installed, they didn't like the way it looked, so they didn't bother putting that in. There was no fire alarm in the building, so one of the stagehands had to run several blocks to the fire station to even let them know that the building was burning. So it was just a perfect storm of disaster. And when it was all over, there were like 275 lawsuits against the owners of the theater, none of which were ever collected on. No one was ever charged. A grand jury indicted a bunch of people, including the mayor of Chicago, but no one was ever charged with anything. So nobody ever paid for what happened. But as I mentioned, 602 people, I guess, were killed. I think I said 12, but I meant 2 because 212 of those were children who died in that fire. Not surprisingly, there's a ghost story left behind. As you mentioned, the Iroquois Theater isn't there anymore. It was reopened for years as a theater. It became the Oriental Theater, a movie theater, for a long time. But eventually it was torn down. Just the foundation and lower parts of the building are still the Iroquois. The Nederlander Theater is on the site now. But even so, staff members, guests, they all talk about it being haunted. They talk about hauntings in other buildings nearby that were used as emergency shelters and medical stations after the fire, including Marshall Fields, which is now Macy's. And of course, Death Alley behind the theater also has its ghost stories too. So yeah, I saved that story for last in the book because it's always been one of my favorites too.
Yeah.
It's just a fascinating story as to everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong.
Yeah. To me, when I read the story, I'm like, this would make such a perfect
movie.
Reenactment, old school audio drama kind of thing. But I'm sure someone's done it.
It would make a great film.
Yeah,
great film. A great movie. I don't know how this has never been made. I just don't get it.
Yeah. So for the ghost stories with it, the one that I'm most familiar with is Death Alley and the ballerina. Or the dancer, I guess.
Yeah, the aerial ballet.
Yeah.
Dancer. Yeah. And that's a confusing story because there are a couple of different possible people it could be, like Nellie Reed, who was a pretty famous aerialist of the time. We know she died in the fire, but there were stories about how she burned to death while hanging above the stage. But then there are other stories about how she burned to death, but made it out of the theater. And then there's maybe another aerialist, and I talk about this in the book, who may have also been the one who was up in the air because some people claim they saw her, but that it wasn't Nellie. The thing about Nellie is nobody even knows where she ended up being buried. She was supposed to be buried in New York in a friend's, family plot. And then some people say she was buried back in England where she was from. And so there's a big mystery involving that story, which maybe is where the ghost story comes from. But yeah, Death Alley, though, for sure is the one that people talk about and experience the most. People who don't even know that the alley is supposed to be haunted, will feel cold spots in the middle of summer. They'll hear voices or someone following them down the alley, or they'll hear children laughing or crying or playing in the alleyway when there are no kids around. One of my favorite stories was always about how sometimes women who are mothers and walk down that alleyway and will feel what seems to be a small hand grab a hold of theirs as they walk through the alley, as if someone is, trying to make a connection and, maybe follow them home, So.
Yeah. So the legend I've heard, and I think it was Nellie Reed, it just ramps the horror factor. Is
Sure.
So she's suspended, the thing she's on catches on fire, she's seeing the fire spread, she's choking on smoke, it's almost like a saw trap, and then the thing that holds her snaps, she falls to the floor, where she breaks her leg. She is partially burned as the fire rushes the stage, but by then like the fire departments come, they've got those side doors open, they're dragging people out, and she dies 3 days later. That's the legend I know.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And that's one of like four. It's crazy. I don't know. I mean, I know it was 1903, but it's amazing that as much as we know today about stuff and the way we're able to, put records back together. I really delved into this story in a completely separate book, much longer than what I put in here, about the minutia of the fire, a little bit more of that. And I can't figure out which story's true. I mean, the newspapers print them all as true, every version. So it's like, okay, well, here they are. You decide whatever you think, because I don't have any idea. So
yeah. we could talk about the newspapers, because one story, Chicago lore. We're just a sidetrack here.
Yeah.
One of my favorite tragic tales is Adela Langer at the Congress Plaza Hotel.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And that family, like the press, I was just so surprised at how awful they could be towards the husband and Adela. And it's a tragic tale where they fled Czechoslovakia because of the Nazi occupation.
Head of the Nazis.
Yeah, because they're a Jewish family. So they leave, and essentially they can't get asylum anywhere. And spoiler alert, it's a murder-suicide, I guess you would call it.
Yeah.
And then like the press just rips the family apart.
Oh, I know.
In print. I'm just
yeah.
It's like, wow.
I know. Yeah, that is a bad one. I was researching the Congress Hotel and going year by year through, or actually day by day, pretty much through every single thing I could find about the auditorium and the Congress, the different names of the hotel. And that story is unreal. I mean, like you said, the way that those people were just roasted over the coals for everything that happened. And it's such a tragedy, but the press could have cared less. They just wanted to paint them as these awful people. And I mean, for those who aren't that familiar with the story, as Jacob said, that it was a murder-suicide, and the children are alleged to haunt the hotel now. The floor that I don't want to spoil too much of a story, but mom grabbed the kids, jumped out the window. And so the kids now haunt the hotel from the floor where this happened. And it's, you wouldn't believe how many deaths have occurred in that building.
It was like Agatha Christie novel.
It is insane. Again, that would be, you know what? You couldn't even write a movie about it. People wouldn't believe it. They would say it was too far over the top. It's so many murders and suicides and bizarre things that happen in that theater. I didn't even know where to stop. It was so insane. It's like, okay, no one's even going to believe this. I mean, it's this much. But yeah, it's a fascinating place, but that's a horrible story that comes out of it. But you're right. You can't take especially the Chicago press time, back in the early 1900s, or even a little before, there were so many newspapers covering everything. I mean, that's the reason that, people like Al Capone are seen as like this anti-hero now. This guy was a scumbag. I mean, a murderer who ordered the murders of hundreds of people, and yet we look at him as this clever guy who, because that's the press turned him into, he's just giving people what they want.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the Chicago press is unreal. So it's no surprise that there are varying versions of pretty much every story.
I mean, so this is why I tell everyone about Capone, because you're right. There's a lot of glamour around him. Like, look, the guy banged a hooker, got syphilis, went crazy, and died.
Yeah.
That's what happened to Al Capone.
Yeah.
And a lot of his henchmen either shot or they killed themselves on train tracks in the suburbs. That's about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. It's crazy.
And now here's Jake's spooky spin.
So with another Christmas thing, this is a great thing. Let's talk about Christmas tree logistics here.
Oh yeah, yes. Yeah. So, which again, one of those things most people don't know.
Yeah.
They don't know that, we haven't always had Christmas trees. People don't realize that. So I mean, they started out as a Celtic and Nordic thing, but in America, there were no Christmas trees before the late 1840s. It's not that we didn't have evergreens. Well, not in Chicago, because Chicago was built on a swamp on the edge of Lake Michigan. So in the 1840s, when Queen Victoria adopted her husband, Prince Albert's traditions from Germany of Christmas trees and put one up at the castle in England, and then people got a load of it. Everybody wanted one. Well, when the craze hit Chicago, everybody wanted Christmas trees, but there was no place to get one because they just don't grow there. So years later, in 1887, these two brothers, August and Herman Schunemann, decide that, wait a minute, we know how we can get Christmas trees. Let's get some boats, go up to the north side of Michigan, harvest a bunch of trees, bring them back to Chicago, and make a fortune, which is what they started doing. And it became a Christmas tradition of the Christmas tree ship. Now, the thing you got to remember with this story is that these ships were not built to, haul Christmas trees. They were just schooners that had been had been built to haul coal and things around the Great Lakes. And these guys wanted to, keep their budget as low as possible. So they bought the junkiest, most rundown, crappiest boats they possibly could for a song. And because they figured, I'm only going to use this thing for, once a year, to haul Christmas trees. So we don't want to spend a bunch of money on it. And the other thing to remember, though, is that they were taking these boats up in mid to late November to the north part of Lake Michigan, at the worst time of year for the Great Lakes. By then, no one was sailing on the Great Lakes because it was just too dangerous. But these guys figured it's only one trip. We're going to do it. And off they'd go in these leaky, horrible boats. And it went on and it became a family business. I mean, it took off and people would flock down to the Clark Street docks to get their trees when the Christmas tree ship would come in and all kinds of stuff. Well, finally in 1910, this is where the story really takes a turn. The brothers bought a new schooner, the Rouse Simmons. Well, new to them. It had actually been built back in 1868. Yeah, that's how old it was. And it's made out of wood. And it was said that when they brought this thing to dock, that the boat had deteriorated so rapidly that even the rats had deserted it. They wouldn't even stay on it. It was that bad. Rats have this. That's one of those sailor superstitions. If you see rats leaving your ship, you don't want to get on it because it's bad news. And that's not even a superstition. That's just common sense because rats seem to have a sense for this kind of thing. But anyway, in November of 1912, they took the Rouse Simmons up to Michigan, loaded it up with tens of thousands of trees, and started heading back to St. Louis, good grief, heading back to Chicago, and somewhere along the way just disappeared. They never came back. They never made it back. Eventually, the only things found, there was a message in a bottle that was found that said something like, "Help me." I mean, not exactly, but close to that. Hey, our boat's going down. God save us all. They found Herman Schunemann's wallet with papers still in it, floating, and they found a bunch of broken Christmas trees. So they just assumed that a storm that had come up had sunk the ship. Eventually, they found the ship not far from Milwaukee in 1971. Some divers found it, and that's where it had finally gone down. But the stories of the Christmas tree ship in Chicago, though, it was such a big deal to the city, and people were so upset and sad about the tragedy that the family ended up getting like pieces of Christmas trees and turning them into wreaths, and people paid extravagant amounts of money because they knew this is the only way to support the family. But the daughter and the wife and some of the family members ended up keeping the Christmas tree ship alive until 1938. Another ship was donated for them, and they kept the business going. But the Rouse Simmons itself, though, is, and I know that this is what appealed to you about this, because we were talking about this before we started recording about where you used to live and where you grew up. But the Rouse Simmons is one of the famous ghost ships of the Great Lakes, at least of Lake Michigan. Over the years, people have seen it traveling covered in ice, draped in ice, disappearing into the fog and the mist. And they've seen it from shore. They've seen it from other ships, and people are supposed to recognize it because of the smell of pine and the fact that the ship is covered in ice, and it just kind of disappears into the lake. So it's one of those stories. And there's another story that's I think is kind of silly, so I didn't include it in the book. But they say that the cemetery where Captain Schunemann's wife is buried and where his gravestone is, even though they never found his body, but it's got a Christmas tree etched on it. They say that if you go out to the cemetery, that you will, even though there are no pine trees around, that you'll be overwhelmed with the smell of pine needles, which I think is silly. So I didn't include it in the book. But so there's a bonus for you, even if you read the book. There's another story.
Great. I was going to say, with the Great Lakes, so folks, I grew up in Superior, Wisconsin, so up by Duluth, practically Canada.
Yeah.
And the one thing, it's like, really, the ships get off in mid-November. They go and they dock because the storms are so intense when those winter storms come down. Like the big one, what was it, in 1913, like November 16th, somewhere around there, was like the storm of the century that sank 40 ships. But like, they're inland seas, the waves get 20 feet or higher.
Oh yeah.
And that schooner thing would get flipped, especially with all that. It would list and flip.
Yeah, with all that weight, it was, it had to be top heavy, and it was probably leaking. And, this thing was a floating pile of hot garbage anyway. I mean, it was so old and so falling apart that it was dangerous as it was. And so they didn't have a prayer once they got hit by the storm. Yeah. So,
and there's microstorms that pop up across the Great Lakes. Like my favorite ghost ship story is for the SS Bannockburn. And it just went out, I think it was another November foundering. And there was just a quick storm that formed. It was filled with grain. It shifted to one side. The ship listed, got hit by a wave, flipped up, and right down she went. It was like, a 1,500 ton, one of those steel.
Yeah. Like the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Yeah. Not as big.
That's the one that everybody knows.
Yeah.
Song, but same thing though. November, they were out in November, and that song is based on a true story. So it's and it's also one of those ghost ships. So there's a lot of them up there, and this is why.
Yeah,
you're not supposed to be on the lake in November.
Yeah.
Just leave it at
Stay out of that water, people.
It's kind of like the Iroquois Theater. I mean, they knew better. Yeah, but they packed people in there anyway and just figured, hey, what could go wrong? Same thing with these boats. It's It's only one trip. We'll be fine.
Yeah, that's the case I use for like the Final Destination opening scene.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfect.
So Troy, let's step back here. I mean, what got you into the creepy paranormal stuff and writing about it?
Honestly, it's been something I've been interested in my whole life. My family was Irish. My great grandfather was a cop, like a walking stereotype. But and so he would always tell me stories, ghost stories and crime stories and things. And so, I just kind of had this fed into me my entire life. And I actually recount a story in this book about what got me interested in like Christmas tragedies. And because I grew up in a small town in Illinois and we had a coal mine. And in the 1930s, and there was a disaster on Christmas Eve and killed like 50 some guys. Well, it was a small town, and 50 guys, that was like every family in town had somebody in that coal mine who died, including a lot of friends of mine whose parents and grandparents, aunts, uncles had been immigrants who worked in the mine. And, they would always tell stories about how at Christmas time, they would have visitations at their home from these relatives that had died in the mine disaster. And so that kind of got me interested in at least the disasters and stuff. And then, as I got older, I got an interest in ghost stories and true crime and history that I'd always had. And so I started writing about it and doing tours because I thought, well, this beats having a real job. And so I just turned this into a job. And so I've been doing it ever since. In 2023, this will be my 30th year of doing tours and writing and things like that. So, it's just it's part of my personality. So, I mean, it's what I do. It's my day job. This is what I do every day. And I love what I do. So it's not a real job. I understand that. But it's as real a job as I'm ever going to have. So, I mean, at this point, I'm unemployable by anybody else. So I have to keep doing this, but that's okay because I like doing it. So we're good.
So let's talk about other authors. I mean, who was a big inspiration for you as a kid? I know I was Chris Claremont of the Uncanny X-Men because I was a comic book reader.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I get that. So, well, I think I started reading Stephen King when I was in like 6th grade. But even before that, there was this guy. Oh man, I should have known you'd ask me this, and now I can't. His name was Richard Weiner. And he only wrote a handful of books, but he wrote a book called Haunted Houses, one called More Haunted Houses, one called Houses of Horror, and I don't know, something about the Bermuda Triangle or something, which I didn't really have much interest in. But these books came out when I was like 10 or 11, and I just ate them up. I mean, and as the years went by, I found a lot of the famous stories that he wrote about that they were completely inaccurate. But you can't blame people who are writing about this stuff in the 70s because they don't have the access to, historical research and newspapers that we have now. So I find a lot of mistakes now. But when I was a kid, man, these were the best stories ever. When I was about 11, my family went to New Orleans, and I made my mom take me to like every house he wrote about in the book, so I could at least see them from outside, and I think that was kind of one of the things that hooked me, at least as far as that stuff goes. And as I got older, I discovered people like Harry Price, the ghost hunter, and things like that. And so yeah, that's kind of what set me into what I do, is stuff like that mixed with a lot of Stephen King. So, I was already, reading things that, I probably shouldn't have been reading at the age of 12. But, I remember doing The Exorcist for a book report when I was in the 7th grade. And that did not go over well with my teacher. But, hey, at least they knew I was reading because I was a voracious reader. So they at least knew that I was reading books, and I still remember being in like English class, and, people would have to give like an oral book report, and the teacher would set aside one day, out of every week or so where people could read whatever book they were working on for their library thing. Well, Jesus, I'd read 10 books since then. So when I'd come up to give my oral report, she'd just go, okay, let's listen. What are you reading now? Because I already, these people, I'd see the people with the same books for like 9 weeks, one book they're still reading, and she knew that I'd read tons. So she didn't even, okay, hey, go sit down. It didn't matter what it was. She knew I was reading. So that's what I always tell people. If you ever want to write, the best thing that you could do is read, not so that you can, copy other people or be influenced too strongly, but at least know about reading. Because I didn't enroll in writing classes. I don't have a degree in English or anything like that. I learned to write by reading and, trial and error and having people who weren't afraid to tell me, dude, you got to fix this, and so and that's okay, and so it's worked for me after all these years. And I honestly couldn't imagine doing anything else. And if I can't, for some reason, I can't write, I would go into like withdrawals anyway. So it's not even like, even if no one even read the books, I'd still have to write something because it's just, you have to, it's just the way it is.
Now, do you have any particular process you use?
Well, I write a lot of books, because I always have usually 3 to 5 projects going all at the same time. Now I don't finish all of them. I keep a list of everything that I want to do. And then everything will be in varying stages of completion. Like I just started doing some reading about this topic. And then another one, I've already been digging up newspaper articles and finding research on stuff. And then there'll be another one that, this is what I feel like I really want to do now. So that's what I finish. That's what I go full bore on. And then I'll spend another couple of days messing around with other projects. So I've always got something happening, but I'm also doing like working on presentations for our dinner and spirits things. I've got a podcast, got to write scripts for the podcast. So I'm writing and writing and writing every day. That's what I do every single day. If I'm in the office, I'm writing something. So, of some kind, So.
Okay, so it's more, I guess they call them pantsers. You got plotters and pantsers.
Yeah.
Pantsers are like, here's my idea. I'll just start going and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. I think that describes it pretty well.
Okay. Stephen King's a pantser too.
Yeah, it describes it pretty well. So that makes a lot of sense. So
okay. So Troy, you talked about you always got 3 to 5 things going on. What you got going on?
Well, right now, nothing because it's Christmas, but it's not going to be long. You mentioned it when we were starting that we're going to have tickets for the Haunted America conference going on sale in early January, the 9th. And that is our biggest event of the year. We've been doing this. This will be our 26th year for the conference. And we got a great bunch of ladies this year. We have all our speakers, except for me, are women this year. So it's an all-female driven conference, and we're moving to a new location. We always have it in Alton, Illinois every year, which is kind of a base of our operations. I do a lot of tours and events, and we've got a bookstore and all kinds of things right in Alton. But we've been having a conference there for years, and we decided to move it to a much larger location with better seats. Like actual theater seating. We've just always had it in, conference chairs, wedding chairs, you know what I mean? And that gets sore after a while. So we're going to be in actual theater seats. We've got 900 seats. We got a vendor room twice the size of our old one. It's going to be a great year, and we're super excited about it. So it is June 23rd and 24th of 2023, and we're right in the middle of the country. We get people who come in from, all over the place, but from the surrounding states, especially because we're right in the center. So it's easy to get there from, Missouri, Illinois, Wisconsin, wherever. So we're excited about that. In February is our annual Dead of Winter food drive. We've been doing this for, 20 some years. We do a food drive in February. It's a free event. We'll have speakers and all kinds of things going on. We have it at the Haunted Mineral Springs Hotel in Alton, and it's right across the river from St. Louis. And the only price of admission is to bring a canned good or non-perishable item. And then we donate those to food banks, because by February, all the Christmas generosity is gone. So the food banks are starting to run a little low. So we have always just donated tons. I mean, people are great. They're really the people in the ghost community are really generous people, and they bring tons of stuff. And every year the people at the food banks are just lose their minds over how much great stuff they get. So we've got that coming up. It's February 11th. And that's all on the website. If you just go to AmericanHauntings.net, everything is on there. All the stuff that we do, from the wintertime ghost tours that we do, the bus tours, to the dinner and spirits events that I do. So yeah, I keep busy all the time. You know, I don't know. Like I said, I love doing what I do. So the more that I can entertain people with it, the better. So
okay.
It's a blast.
Okay. So before we wrap up, I'll throw it at you. If you could pick 3 books off American Hauntings Inc. that you think would be a great introduction to Troy Taylor, which ones would you pick?
Well, let's not go with the Christmas book that we're talking about, because let's be honest, in like a week, no one is going to want that till next year. So I think that as far as just finding out what I do and what I like, and what I write about, I would say, I'm looking at books right now. That's why I'm turning my head to look. I would say American Hauntings is the name of one of my titles. It is the history of ghosts in American popular culture and how it affected American history. So it's a big, thick read, and it's got a lot of entertaining stuff in it, from, you know, the Fox sisters through the Amityville Horror and TV shows and all that kind of stuff. So that's got a little of everything. Another of my favorites is maybe Beyond the Grave, which is a book I wrote about haunted graveyards. And I really, that's one of my favorites. It's just a fun book to write. And so it just tells a lot of different stories. Without a Trace is one that would cover kind of my true crime interests, because that's a book about unexplained and unsolved disappearances. And so that's one that I think that a lot of, I mean, it's one of my most popular titles. People love it just because it's just, I mean, there's no answer to any of it other than what explanations I try to give it. And I'm also going to throw in Forlorn Hope, which is my book about the Donner Party. It's because that's one of my favorites. I do a dinner. I do a dinner about the Donner Party.
Appropriate.
I know, at the end of every January, and late January, it's dinner with the Donner Party, and I always tell everybody to bring an appetite. You never know what'll be on the menu, kind of thing. But it is that's just one of my favorite books, personal favorites that I've written. So, and there's I don't know, there's a lot. I mean, people ask me, oh, what's your favorite book? And I go, I don't know. What are you interested in? Because I really just write what interests me. And so it's really one of those things where you have to know what is good to you. What do you have an interest in? Because I've probably written something about it, or at least I will at some point if I haven't yet. But yeah, so that's kind of the, direction I like to steer people. So, okay.
And should someone want to get a hold of you, book you to speak, say at their conference, how would they get a hold of you?
The easiest way is, you can email me through the website, which is AmericanHauntings.net, or just look me up on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. I've got a pretty big author page. I post every single day, multiple times, usually about, whatever is happening in the world of weird and true crime things. I do like a daily thing, and, on this date in 1881, that kind of stuff. So I'm pretty easy to find on Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, all that kind of stuff. But Facebook and Instagram for sure. So yeah, I'm easy to find there, and that's probably the best way to reach me.
Okay.
So.
And folks, even though this is pre-recorded, we will be broadcasting it live tomorrow night. And Wendy, Merle, and I will be telling some of our favorite ghost stories in between the segments of the show. But we'll put all of Troy's links in the chat while we're doing that. So no worries. And then Troy, stick around after this, because we're at the end of the show, but I want to talk a little shop.
Okay, sounds good, man.
All right. Thanks for tuning in to Mystic Moon Cafe, everyone. Have a lovely Christmas and holiday season, or in this case, a dark bleak.
Yeah, a dark, bleak holiday season, but with good things too, and lots of food. That's the main thing.
Yeah, so, and spiked eggnog.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.